All right, let's jump right in. We're about to go back in time to solve one of the greatest detective stories in all of science. We're talking about the mystery of hereditary and how it was all cracked by a single monk with his garden peas. You know how this goes, right? It's something we all see in our families. Maybe you've got your dad's eyes, but then your kid shows up with your grandmother's nose, a nose that you don't even have. So, how does that happen? I mean, where do these traits even go for a generation? And how in the world do they come back? So, for centuries, that was a total mystery. Seriously, science just didn't have a solid answer. The big ideas at the time were, well, let's just say they were pretty messy. But the key, the thing that would unlock this whole puzzle, it wasn't discovered in some high-tech lab. Nope, it was found in a quiet monastery garden, all thanks to the incredibly patient work of Gregor Mendel. Okay, so to really get just how brilliant Mendel was, you have to understand what he was up against. See, there was this big prevailing theory about how heredity worked, and it was one of those ideas that sounds simple, it feels right, it's totally intuitive, and it also happens to be completely wrong. Yeah, pretty much everyone back then believed in something called blending inheritance. The idea is simple. If you mix red and white paint, you get pink. So if a tall person and a short person have a kid, that kid should be medium height, right? The traits just blend together forever. But Mendel, he had a different idea. He suspected that traits weren't like paint at all. He thought they were more like Lego bricks, discrete, individual units that you could pass down. They might get hidden under another brick, sure, but they were never actually destroyed or blended away. So, our detective, Mendel, decides to put his theory to the test. And his choice of subject? Absolutely brilliant. The humble garden pea. He was about to set up an experiment that would, and this is no exaggeration, change science as we know it. So why peas? I mean, of all things. Well, they were the perfect little subjects for this kind of detective work. They were super fast, he could totally control who pollinated who, and this is the book one. They had these very clear, distinct traits. A plant was either tall or dwarf. A seed was either round or wrinkled. There was none of this kinda tall or sorta wrinkly stuff. And here's the other genius move. He started with what are called true breeding plants. All that means is that when they self-pollinate, they always produce offspring that look just like them. So a true breeding tall plant, it's only ever going to make more tall plants. It's pure, genetically speaking. All right, here we go. The experiment begins. Mendel takes one of his true breeding tall plants and crosses it with a true breeding dwarf plant. This is what we call the P generation for parental. Now, think back to that blending theory. What should we expect to see here? You'd think you'd get a field full of medium-height plants, wouldn't you? A perfect 50-50 blend of tall and dwarf. Makes sense. But that's not what Mendel saw. Not even close. What he got was 100% tall offspring. Every single plant. They were all tall. Not medium, not kind of tall, just plain tall. It's like the dwarf trait had just, poof, vanished into thin air. Okay, so this is the big mystery, right? The central clue of our whole story. The dwarf trait is gone. But is it gone for good? Is it destroyed? Or is it just hiding somewhere? A lesser scientist might have stopped there. But this is where Mendel's real genius kicks in. He knew the experiment wasn't over. So what he did next was crucial. He took those tall plants from the F1 generation and let them self-pollinate. Basically, he was letting these hybrid plants cross with each other. And their offspring would be the F2 generation. So the big question is, what happens now? Are they all going to be tall again? And just like that, the ghost returns. The dwarf trait reappeared out of nowhere. In this F2 generation, Mendel meticulously counted his results. He found 787 tall plants and 277 dwarf plants. The trait that had totally disappeared was back, and it looked exactly the same as the original dwarf grandparent. This wasn't chaos, this was a clue. There was a pattern here. And this is where Mendel's background in math was so important. He looked at those numbers, 787 tall to 277 dwarf, and he realized something incredible. That is almost exactly a 3-to-1 ratio. And get this, he did the same experiment for 6 other traits, seed color, pod shape, you name it. And every single time, the hidden trait came back in this same predictable 3-to-1 ratio. That's not a coincidence. That's a That 3-to-1 ratio, that was the Rosetta Stone. It was the key that allowed Mendel to unlock the whole thing. From this one simple mathematical pattern, he figured out the basic rules of heredity, what we now call his postulates. Okay, so postulate number one. He proposed that for any given trait, like height, an organism has two unit factors that control it, one inherited from each parent. We don't call them unit factors anymore. Today we call them alleles. So for the gene for plant height, you've got the tall allele and the dwarf allele, and every plant has a pair of. Number two, he figured out the idea of dominance, and this right here, this solves the mystery of that first generation, the F1s. The tall allele, he realized, is dominant, while the dwarf allele is recessive. So if a plant has one of each, you only see the dominant one. The tall trait shows up. But that recessive dwarf allele, it's still there. It's just hiding. It's being masked, but it's not blended or gone forever. And that leads to this absolutely critical distinction. We've got the genotype. That's the actual genetic makeup the pair of alleles an organism has. And then we have the phenotype. That's the physical trait you can actually see, like tall or dwarf. So this explains everything. A plant can look tall, that's its phenotype, but it can secretly be carrying that hidden dwarf allele in its genotype. So what's so cool about Mendel's ideas is that they didn't just explain what had happened. They could predict what would happen. They were a tool. And the easiest way for us to see this in action is with a handy little grid called a Punnett square. Let's walk through this. Remember those F1 plants? Their genotype is big D, little d. When they make their reproductive cells, those two alleles separate. So half the cells get the dominant big D, and the other half get the recessive little d. We put those possibilities from one parent across the top, and from the other parent down the side. Now, you just fill in the boxes to see all the possible combinations for the kids. And look at that. We get 1 DD, 2 DDs, and 1 DD. That's a 1 to 2 to 1 genotypic ratio. But what do they look like? Well, the DD is tall, and the 2 DDs are also tall. Only the DD is dwarf. So that's 3 tall to 1 dwarf. Boom, there's our 3 to 1 phenotypic ratio. Explained perfectly. But you know, a good detective doesn't just stop at a great theory. They need to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Mendel had to prove that some of those tall F2 plants were DD and others were DD, even though they looked exactly the same. So how could he possibly do that? With one more brilliant little experiment, the test cross. The logic here is so clever. You take the tall plant whose genotype you don't know, and you cross it with a dwarf plant. Now, you know the dwarf plant's genotype has to be little d. So look at the two possibilities. Case 1, if your tall plant is big D, then all of its offspring will get a big D and they'll all be tall. But case 2, if your mystery plant is big D, then half its kids will get the big D and be tall, but the other half will get the little d and be dwarf. You'll get a 1-to-1 ratio. So if even a single dwarf plant shows up in the offspring, you've just proven that the tall parent was secretly carrying that recessive allele. Case closed. And here's what just blows my mind. Mendel figured all of this out without ever seeing a gene, without knowing what a chromosome was. None of that had been discovered yet. He was describing the precise behavior of invisible things based on nothing but pure logic and the patterns he saw in his garden. It's just incredible how far ahead of his time he was. He published all this back in 1866, and the world basically shrugged. His work went almost completely unnoticed for more than 30 years. It wasn't until 1900 that a few scientists, totally independently, stumbled across his paper and realized what a bombshell it was. And then, just a few years after that, other scientists like Sutton and Boveri were looking at cells under a microscope and saw chromosomes for the first time, and they realized these chromosomes were moving and separating during reproduction in the exact way Mendel had predicted his factors should. They finally found the physical things, the Lego bricks, that Mendel had only described in theory. So Mendel's work with his peas gave us the absolute bedrock of genetics, the foundational rules for how these simple traits work. But in solving that first mystery, he opened the door to 1,000 more. He gave us the tools to start asking much deeper questions about the incredibly complex dance of genes that makes each of us unique. His amazing detective story in a quiet monastery garden, well, that was really just chapter 1 of a much bigger mystery that we're all still trying to solve today.